Washington here. I've got a pretty good signal for the time being, so we're going to make of it what we can. We've got our patrons, including a brand new patron, our Unfinished Journey, that has been added to the list. I would like to thank every single person on that list who have helped and stuck with the project all of this time, because it really does help every single month to have that amount of stuff coming in to help make ends meet and make sure that I've got ink and paper and all the stuff that needs, and plus food, that food stuff. Yeah, we don't worry about that. So anyway, let's get on with the enlarge the screen to the exciting world. As of course you know, this is continuing Replacing Darwin, the last dregs of the footnotes in their book about replacing Darwin. As you recall from last week, Jensen was getting into the homozygous versus heterozygous mutation issue, and how this supposedly showed that species are getting kind of more fixed to where they can't really do speciation, and therefore by implication suggesting that there was a lot more speciation in the post-flood times or in the post-creation times that is reflected in the genetic code. Well, all of this, of course, is simply reflecting the fact that the current lineages that we have on the planet are descended from organisms that have a very, very long, hello, Barbara, have a very long history going back way beyond the flood. And so in principle, the data field, if you just compress it down, of course, is going to kind of look the way he's thinking it is. The problem are the little fiddly bit details. And what he does with this one is continuing with kitty cats or tigers and domestic cats. And so he cites a couple papers. A 2013 paper from Cho on the tiger genome, which I will be putting the link up to, and a 2014 paper from PNAS from Montague on the domestic cats. Now, he doesn't discuss any of the actual content of those papers. He just cites them, boop, and moves on. Well, the Cho paper on the tiger genome has the Felidae radiation that they're studying relation to tiger formation over the last 11 million years. And the genetics and of that need to be accounted for, as to biogeography of felids as well. There's a whole cornucopia of relevant issues that are attendant in bringing this stuff up, and he doesn't deal with it. The Montague paper on the domestic cats has the deep origins of the felids way back, even before tigers are splitting off in the field, back 92 million years, which means pre-Cretaceous. Not that there were any felids at that point, but the ancestors of the ancestors of the ancestors of that group splitting off from their nearest main taxonomic relatives in the family go back that far. And all of that, and domestic cats are known from 7000 BC on Cyprus. So that's like 1,000 years before the creation of the universe in the creationist model. So more biogeography. Oh, Ian Chan, Happy New Year, Ian. Can't stay off to late dinner with the family. You can catch the show later. We'll get in what we can, and away we go. I'll allude before you dash off that this part two of the thing, as Tompkins and Clary from 2019, I'll be putting links in on dinosaurs had reptilian metabolic adaptation. Boop. And they cited several papers that they're misrepresenting as usual. It's so desperate to try to disconnect birds from dinosaurs. And so they're claiming that the metabolic data does this. And to that end, they cite a paper from 2019 by Lind on the Komodo dragon genome, which I'll be putting a link up to. And that relates to a lineage that is particularly ironic, because the Komodo dragons are in the reptile line that isn't thought closely related to dinosaurs. So any genetic gleaning you do isn't really cluing you in, even in a way that you would by looking at crocodile genomes or looking at birds. And what are the archosaurs that we have to deal with? Crocodiles would be the closest measure. So it's a apples and oranges shell game misrepresentation to try to make big deals out of the Komodo genome, as if it was relevant to what was going on in the line in the diapsids that are leading off into archosaurs and dinosaurs and into birds. So bloop, all of that is just astonishing. Anyway, the whole neat bit about why this section of Jensen has been so illuminating is because he is homing in on families, which are the taxonomic level that creationists deem to be kinds. And so every single one of these that he brings up, all of them by definition are extant ones. Apparently later in the chapter, he's going to be dangling around the prospects of discussing extinct kinds and fossil data. And it's going to be funky to see which examples he plays with, particularly in relation to what's going on at the Ark Encounter and their listing of kinds. So all of this stuff I'm doing is directly relevant to Rocks Were There Volume 2, where there's going to be the big breakdown of the creationist kind list in such a way that people who have the book will be able to actually make sense of it. Their list is particularly funky because I can't figure out what order they're using, or rather, I suspect I know what order they're using for the kinds listing within big groups like mammals and dinosaurs. They got them all in big categories. But why are they in the order that they are? They aren't in alphabetical order. And since by definition, kinds are specially created with no relationship to any other organism, they're boop, zot, and there's the family kind created. Why wouldn't you list them alphabetically? So what it looks like is they're being listed phylogenetically, evolutionary phylogenetically. In other words, in the order that they're finding them on the Wikipedia page is what I'm suspecting. And the only way I'll be able to look into this closer is after I get the whole list compiled and to see just exactly why they're clunking ones down next to what they are. Typically, they get into some funky issues with amphibians because so many of the amphibian families are known by single species and they're sufficiently diverged that they're giving separate families. And so there's a ton of amphibian species in all of this. Gutsick Gibbon and Dapper Dino and a variety of people have already pointed out odd eccentricities into why they're hair splitting some of the things that they are. And I've already spotted some examples of in Jensen's stuff, which I mentioned a few weeks back last year, about how he's relying on evolutionary phylogenetics to decide how to break up a family and diving into what things are based on modern systematics, not based on any viable functional creationist systematics. So all of that will be really fun, clear. And there will also be a listing of the Ark Encounter kinds in the appendix that will be in complete alphabetical order. So if anybody wants to go, do the creationists at AIG think that X is a kind or not? You'll be able to locate it easily because there will be that alphabetical listing. It's extremely interesting that Answers in Genesis has not gone out of their way to assist in that regard. So that chart that's at the Ark Encounter, the only accounts of it that you can find are coming from creationism critics who have visited the Ark Encounter and gone, ooh, isn't that an interesting list? Click and take a picture of it, or the somewhat blurry picture of it that's visible in the website at Ark Encounter. The idea that they would like post the detailed listing and horrors, the documentation that they would use to work out why they have the list they do and in what structure that there is to it. Why that would help scholars. And you'd think if the creationists were rigorous scientists, they would be anxious, positively chomping at the bit to supply all of this information in such a way that scholars can look at it in detail and understand exactly why the creationist model is so fantastically informative and useful, and that they would be able to, new people could come in and they could springboard off of the insights that are available from the kind list to be able to understand nature in even greater detail. But that's not an option if the model isn't correct. if it's never going to be possible for them to hair split the characteristics as to defining why families are the systematic things and why closely related families aren't in fact blurring if you look at it from a barometerological perspective. And that I know, for example, that there's been virtually no work done on the therapsids. They have a long list of therapsids extinct, and they call them, even call them mammal-like reptiles on the list, without giving any indication of why, how many of those are justified, because there's been virtually no barometerological work done. I think the Cassiids were about the only family that's had some work, and the guy that wrote that paper, Aaron, back a few years, bypassed most of the data, even with the Cassiid example. So it was an incredible cherry picking. It would be fun to see. They've had to do something in the same ballpark. There's been a small number of creationists who've kind of tiptoed into dinosaurs and tyrannosaurs and all that bunch. But it's nothing to make regular systematics go away. And it's certainly nothing to impress anybody that's an actual working paleontologist. So it's one of those things that I think deserves greater detailed analysis, precisely to show how absolutely arbitrary and useless the arc encounter listing is. And remember, the arc encounter listing is the smallest any creationists have managed to trim down the size of the arc listing so that you can viably argue that they could all be on board the ship. So they have a listing of just 15, well, I think it's under 1,500 kinds aboard. But to do that, they've all have to stay at the family level. They simply have to ignore the whole issue of insects and terrestrial invertebrates that might need to be preserved on the ark because they would drown if they were in the flood. So would they have to have been aboard? Creationists don't like to think about the insects, and they also don't like to deal with the plant issue. And of course, buried in the story is the implausibility of this blasted landscape, and yet there's a an olive tree that's greening up to where the dove can come and pick up an olive branch and bring it back to the ark. No, none of that makes any sense at all. So the inability of Jensen to get past simply repeating the charts and mantras and his stumbling over the data field means that this is a useful measure as to just exactly how poorly the creationist movement is going to be able to deal with things. I think it's extremely relevant to spot how Rupin Sanford and Jensen, even though they're approaching their technical citations in a very different way. Rupin Sanford in the old Contested Bones book were using technical citations largely for authority quoting. And they would have little snippets and long quotations that were very carefully chosen to reach their apologetic point. They would not discuss any of the stuff that changed the perspective or give context or anything like that. They didn't like to do that. Whereas Jensen does virtually no authority quoting in his book. All of his technical citations, for all practical purposes, are aimed at buttressing precise claims. The problem is, as we've seen from example after example after example, he's basically dangling the footnote for the claim and not actually connecting up the content in such a way to make you feel that the information that was presented in the paper actually does make sense better from a creationist perspective. And as we'll be discovering in greater detail when we dive into the next Jensen book after we're finished with this one, he dives off the diving board into the empty pool in Traced, because he's making claims. He's doubling down on the claims of this post-flood diaspora and human colonization of the planet. That because all he's done is just take the genetic field of the human species and go squish it down, means that he's pushing events that took place a long time ago in the genetic mix to way recent, which is how he came up with ideas that certain haplotypes were arriving in the post-Christian period. And it's utterly implausible and counterfactual because we actually have Stone Age burials that have certain haplotypes, as Dan Stern Cardinale has pointed out. And we'll be citing and discussing all of that material when we get to the human evolution stuff in Rocks Were There, Volume 2. And so it's an argument that was so unpersuasive that Robert Carter, fellow creationist and also a geneticist, was exceedingly skeptical of it. So we're seeing a bunch of little operations as to just where this is going to be going among the old guards as you're pitting one group of creationists against another. The fun issue that will be is in the relatively small number of new generation creationists, some of whom are coming from a technical field, some of them are kind of coming from a journalistic field, but where they're going to land on the landscape and how many of them are going to be riffing on their own little version of creationism to see everything fragmenting will be something that we'll be looking at for the next 10 or 20 years to find out whether or not the old model of where you basically had Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis fissioning off into CMI versus AIG, but doctrinally it's pretty much all the same stuff. The split on a lot of these little technical issues, Guliuz's stuff at ICR now pushing the notion that natural selection isn't really a thing. And Jeffrey Tompkins has kind of sidled onto that landscape as well. So it'll be fun to see the newer generation of new creationists that Joel Duff is keeping a closer eye on than I am, to see, do they ever come up with an alternative model? And if so, just how deviant is it from the nuts and bolts issues that are happening over at ICR and the old gangs? I can't make any predictions on the thing because if somebody has fundamentally a bad method, they can go anyway. They can come up with just about anywhere. They can roll off of any side of the landscape. So you see some confusions and disputes about the acceptance or not of accelerated radioactive decay, the issues of whether the flood boundary was in the Neogene or back in the Cretaceous. There's a small cadre, largely at ICR, that I've alluded to at various times, and Joel Duff has noticed it as well, who are pushing that thing down, the end of the flood, to be well past the Cretaceous extinction and well into the Cenozoic. And logically, it's kind of understandable the temptation for them to do that because there's nothing intrinsically different between the fossilization issues that are happening at the Green River in Wyoming versus the Solnhofen in the Jurassic in Europe. And so it's more comfortable from a dogmatic point of view to see the fossil record as part of a contiguous blob where if it's fossilized, it was done in the flood. But that means that as you drag yourself into the Cenozoic, you're starting to bump into more and more taxa that are connecting up more and more directly in the genetic data. And when you get down far enough, where they're going to be into a really conniption fit mode is stuff now that they can extract elements of DNA from as far back as 1 or 2 million years in some cases, if it's been under cold preservation and stuff, that they're going to have to match up that genetic information with the fossilization stuff. I don't see any great movement in the creationist movement to accept that extremely late flood boundary, except at the little cadre of about half a dozen people circulating around Tim Clary at ICR. But time will tell. Now, what goes on down in the bargain basement level, your Standing for Truths and Kent Hovins and all that stuff, that so much of their work is super parasitical. So Kent Hovind is still basically channeling stuff from Walt Brown. So he's stuck in 1970, 1980 kinds of stuff. Standing for Truth can kind of ricochet around. So sometimes he's latching stuff off of Nathaniel Jensen, sometimes Jeffrey Tompkins, and sometimes up and down and in and out. Matt Powell will be pulling stuff out of thin air or out of his butt and that as well. So, and that is largely at the Rupin Sanford authority quoting level. Both Hovind and Standing for Truth types are essentially operating off of quote mining. And they're really not going to be terribly good, especially with their lack of technical qualifications and all. They're not really going to make any serious inroads into the kinds of arguments that are being made by the PhD style creationists that you find at the Robert Carter, Nathaniel Jensen level. Cosmology and things is a slightly different area because you've got so few people involved in it. You know, you've got Hartnett and Humphreys to some extent, and a few others knocking around. So you could practically count on one hand. And so with so few players going on, it's easy for that to appear to be a kind of unified picture, if only because so few people are involved in the thing. There's so few apologists to play off of. So what I anticipate then for the remaining elements in this section of Jensen will be to look into just exactly what new data fields he is bumping into, because the stuff that he did with Cho and Montague and that are papers that he hadn't previously cited anywhere in the work, even though Felids and others kind of came up. It's curious that they didn't show up when he was actually doing the material on the one family of cats that he bumped into in one of his earlier charts. So there's a fascinating compartmentalization that's going on in there that I look at from a scholarly direction. After the traced book, I'm not sure which things we'll dive into. So probably various people watching the show can kind of put on their little thinking caps as to a work that lacks a reference bibliography or coordinated index. In other words, it's a work that is sufficiently meaty, but doesn't have the means to locate where information is in it. Because one of the things that I find so useful about constructing a reference bibliography for a work that doesn't actually have one is it allows you to see the big picture of the thing in a way you can't if all you're doing is going page by page, plowing through footnotes. How do you know what's cited and what isn't? Well, if you have a reference bibliography, you can do that. And in due course, I suppose there'll be a situation if, you know, I can upgrade the kinds of things and straighten out more about what I'm doing on websites and stuff to upgrade to where if I can figure out how to post things better up at the old tip website, theoretically, those spreadsheets and things I can include in that zone. We might even have to start up a new website. I'm not sure exactly what we want to do on this. So everything's kind of up in the air. There was a fellow that was trying to help on certain aspects in this from Eastern Europe. He's in like Ukraine, and they've had things on their head for the last year or so. So that have meant that is put on a back burner. So we'll see what happens on here. But the primary things from my end then is working on the second half of The Rocks Were There, and then there will be other books, of course, that Jackson and I will be working on. But the main thing is to pick off all the elements that we didn't put in the first volume because of the scale of the thing. And we should get that straightened out, hopefully, cross fingers, in 2023. And that means that in the years to come after that, we will be going after the conspiracy thinking book, which is be knee deep in methodology and social culture issues and all that stuff. And then, of course, the big monster, which I suspect will end up being a multi-volume work too, which is the evolution of religion and how human minds develop religion concepts, why certain religions are over others, how the processes have changed over time and all that kind of stuff. And there's enough relevant material that simultaneously would be about a lot of history, plus the cognitive literature angle and the social elements of how things have worked out. So there's a lot of little irons in the fire for any really comprehensive analysis of things. And of course, since it's a lot of people who would be doing histories of religion either would be simply arguing, well, no, but not necessarily dealing with a broad range of things. And so too many criticisms might be just kind of focusing on the Judeo-Christian or Islamic branch rather than think about, well, what's going on with all the other people that's going on? And over the overall long history of human beings, most of the people on the planet over time haven't been, although we have now greater number of people to have numbers bumping in, but the proportions of the population, 0% of people 50,000 years ago were Christians. And so what was going on in their heads? Were they having religion? I would be pretty sure they had something like that. But is it fundamentally different from what we're seeing when we start developing agricultural societies and written languages that put a new dynamic to the preservation and spread of religion? And it's still kind of an up in the air issue about that. I can't rule out at the moment that pre-agricultural cultures may have had a different dynamic because of their smaller scale, the fact that they aren't communicating with cultures except by individuals bumping into one another in trading networks and the like. So I think the whole social dynamic of religions may have been significantly different back in prehistoric times than they are when we get down into the modern things. And of course, all of the major religions that we know on from the world now have originated effectively well after the development of towns and settled agriculture. And so it didn't pop right out of the box that people were doing God of Abraham thing at the early stages of agriculture. It took thousands of years to get to that level. So all of that is going to be quite a neat little fun thing to discuss. Plus, it'll be also about the apologetics. Sort something out of my data. I'm behind listening on 1.5. Listen to it however you like. I think that's the one advantage of YouTube is the fact that, and I often do this, and there's absolutely nothing wrong to do it this way. I'll jump in occasionally for a live show that Jackson is doing where he's talking with somebody and realizing that this might actually go on for a while, or I may jump into it, after an hour and a half. And I just go, oh, I'm just going to copy the URL and plop it into my word processor file and come back to it later. And so although I would no longer be in the capacity to jump into the live chat to be able to do live commentary or something on. I think the world can get by if I don't do live commentary inside of a video, but I can then look at the video at my leisure, and especially if there's a lot of meaty subjects going on where new technical literature is discussed or particular examples of people's histories and the other, where you really have to kind of write stuff down and take notes about it. And then I can have a word processor file that I can keep that relevant information on. And I can pause and adjust it. So sometimes a video that's an hour long, I may take 2 hours or more to actually go through it because I'm stopping and I'm taking down the notes from the various sections that are coming along, or going, oh, I didn't know about that technical paper. I know from the other direction, from the videos that Jackson does where he sends me the scripts beforehand for commentary and that, and he's wonderful writing and straightforward logical constructions on there. But I can guarantee you it's exceedingly rare for me to see a Jackson video where I don't have to add on a bunch of new sources to my reference bibliography, because he has come across material that I wasn't aware of beforehand that's relevant to the points of issues that we're bringing up. And one of the recurring themes in our little chat feeds in Twitter, in our private stuff going on back and forth, is that I would say, keep this in mind for Rocks Volume 2. This is relevant to this particular thing. Ooh, that Origin of Tetrapod chapter, we're going to want to put that stuff in and all that. Insanely perfect weather. Wow. This, yes, well, we are jealous here. I'm just happy not to have floods here. Or ice storms or other gunk. We're coming out of the winter sequence, although even before global warming, weather can be frighteningly unpredictable. And as I like to remind people, lest they get too smug, the great blizzard of 1888 that blanketed the east coast of the United States and buried New York City under like 20 feet of snow took place in March. After warm weather. It was like 60 degrees or so in mid-March, and then suddenly, kaboom, this huge storm system came in and buried the elevated trains and did all sorts of fun. So here we're anticipating, at least we're not in this circumstance. I think there may have been some rain elements on the west coast of Washington lately, but nothing as serious as what's going on in poor California, that's being pounded with this continual array of storm systems, which then go on and generate deadly tornadoes and crap as it moves across the rest of the country. But the point is, it's reached the stage where it's not really helping much with their reservoir situation, because so many of the watershed zones, like the Colorado River, are kind of out of this rain node. But it soaks the water up so much, and the land can't take it, that places are underwater and trees are falling over and crushing cars, and it's just an absolute mess. So the bill's going to climb all over the place. I can tell you for sure nothing like that severity was going on in California back when I lived down there in the 1960s. And the most recurring thing that we had was where there would be fires that would burn Brentwood practically every February, and because there would be drying area in that zone, and then the rains would come in afterwards and wash the ruins of the houses, the big mansions, down in that. And that was kind of like a running joke, a terribly bitter and ironic one, but that was kind of about as serious as things got. This vast climate-driven drought system that's afflicting California, coupled with now these vast disastrous storms, are a thing that will also be a thing following on, because climate science is going to be one of the issues that Jackson Wheat and I will be dealing with in one of those later books. So presages for things to come. So, okay, kids, any questions from our dear peanut gallery as to anything that needs to be commented on? Otherwise, we've got a good half hour in there and the signal has worked well. And otherwise, I'll probably just be blither blathering on about up and down and in and out. And so I've resisted the temptation to start calling this evolution half hour, but oh, purple rhymes with orange. Hello, greetings, sentient beings. Yeah. I do have a lot of fun, at least reprising the things. Some of the juicier bits of stupid that I encounter in my weekly research into the creationist movement is what ends up as the part 2 elements, because an awful lot of that stuff is going to be relevant to stuff that's going to go in the new book. But I always have to make sure that if it's stuff that I can put the direct links on so you can follow up on it. So yes, jabbering away. I try to jabber as much as possible in here. And I can also point out that I'm busy working on the third novel of the Paralogs of Fog series. All of you people who like historical fiction and science fiction and mystery adventure stories, there they are. And there's going to be more to come. As in 10 more books beyond these, that will be following the dear adventures of Phileas Fogg and his kick-butt wife, Aouda, and their charming little valet, Passepartout, who says he's from France, and all the wonderful things that's going on in the decades that are following the stories. And I have a delightful time working on those, because I can indulge all of my non-sciencey related affectations in one area, because I've always loved the Victorian and Edwardian eras. I loved mystery adventures and caper stories and all that. I'll exit on a blathering note. I'll make a listing of if you like caper stories, and by caper stories, it would be things like, well, one of the oldest caper stories that pops up, and this is to be kept separate from heist films, which tend to be more film noir. Heist films are about the gritty world of people stealing things, and often gangs are killing one another, and so they tend not to be comedic in nature. Heist movies, by contrast, have this. I mean, caper films, by contrast, tend to have a lighter and comedic touch to them, although not always. So something like Ocean's 11, or the various remakes that came along, that did tend to have a little bit more humor to them. But Kind Hearts and Coronets, if you've ever seen that one, that's probably one of the earliest ones I can think of that would fall into the caper film category, about this illegitimate kid who angles to find his way to become the Duke by bumping off all of the rivals to the bit, all of whom are played by Alec Guinness, even the women. I mean, it's a charming and droll bit. Then we get down to like Top Copy in 1963. Peter Ustinov, I think, won an Oscar for it. It's a delicious film, and always love watching it. Beautiful all-star cast, Melina Mercuri and all the rest in it. How to Steal a Million with Peter O'Toole and Audrey Hepburn. Wow. From, I think, 64. Gambit with Shirley MacLaine and Michael Caine. One of the most ingenious, delicious caper stories involved. And Herbert Law, I mean, one of the rare instances of where he gets to play a sympathetic character in a movie. I thought we're about canned flowers. Yes. Ooh, you little punster, you. Yes, all about capers. Why would anyone have a movie series about capers? I mean, you take caper out of the little jar and put it in thing. Yeah, right. And what I've always loved about them, and if you think about it, Mission Impossible, both the TV series and the films based on them, are functionally caper stories. Elements of James Bond movies involve kind of caper things, and people going in and thieving stuff and preventing people from thieving stuff and all that. So the genre has a wide range. And so although there are detective elements knocking around in all of the versions and storylines in Paralogs of Fog, the caper element of nabbing something or preventing somebody from doing something in an ingenious way, particularly in a way that they don't realize that it's happened to them. And so the con jobs and various storylines that involve manipulations in that affair. And of course, there's the moral ambiguity of it and all of that. Intrigues me a lot, and it pops up an awful lot in the stories. Plus, I love the historical angle of it, and I also like the science angle of it, both the science fiction-y stuff and also to ground the science fiction in an element of reality and play off the juxtaposition of the Verne and H.G. Wells era science, air quotes, because so much of what we now know is science, they didn't. So that's another little area that I can play off of. So anyway, all of that, if you like, does everybody hit the like buttons? Yes. If you want a funky little book to read, and all of the volumes here, but go after Fog if you like to have a little bit of light elements to it. I'm very pleased with the outcome of them. I enjoyed writing them, and I think they have a range. Not everybody will be attracted to the genre, but I enjoy the kind of thing and doing a little bit of a niche. I'm not attempting to do Marvel super epics where millions of little monster things are attacking somebody to acquire the magic glove that turns everything into dust or whatever, I mean, the usual plots and stuff that come along with this, and superheroes and all of the magical powers and all that stuff. They do that way better than I can do. I like more intimate stories with involving fewer characters, and there's an interplay of trying to do things without magic. And to work things out through reason and a certain amount of panache and wit, because I love writing dialogue that's sharp and clever, and Fogg and company all have a droll sense of humor, and they show it. So anyway, we're at 38 minutes, and I'm probably exceeding my warranty on the blathering front. Everybody stay safe. If you're still worried about issues, the Chinese have kind of zigzagged back and forth on COVID. They should probably rethink, try to hit a middle ground on here. In Washington State, although there are some little areas where some people are concerned to still wear masks in medical settings, like when you visit medical treatment at that, you have to wear a mask to be on that. But in most social settings, it really hasn't been the case, and we're running along fairly smoothly. We've got monkeypox and a few other things floating around in the thing to where we not be careful of. But nevertheless, steer clear of that. Steer clear of getting hit by tornadoes and floods and all the other natural crap that we're now getting nowadays. And we will hope to see you next week, kids. And remember, do not accept any wooden penguins. So the channeled scablands, yes, we've already done the channeled scablands. If giant ice dams start forming at any point and big lakes underneath them, probably you shouldn't buy real estate downstream. Just saying. So later's all and sundry, and we will see you in the next time. Ooh, we got 40 minutes in. Okay, bye till next.